We're now in Luke chapter 16. Depending upon what version of the Bible you have, this is the parable of either the dishonest or the shrewd manager. Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. And then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people will welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, and how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager, because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generations than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters. A slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Thanks be to God for this word to us. This last week was kind of busy. I was catching up from being gone almost the entire week before. And so, knowing it was going to be kind of a packed week, I decided to look up the passage for this week last Sunday night. Kind of get ahead of things. So I opened up the Bible and I read this passage and I went, God hates me. Gone were my hopes for a nice, easy passage, right? With a clean, simple, uplifting message. Instead, what I get is what has to be one of the weirdest parables ever. So today I'm going to try and make sense of Luke 16, and I just encourage you not to try this at home. Some try to make this passage work without embracing the fact that it's really a little peculiar. One of the favorite ways that the commentators approach it is to say, well, you know, in biblical times, these stewards made their living by adding amounts to people's bills. That's how they got paid, was they would add amounts to people's bills, and that's how they made their money for themselves. Well, and they basically said, well, you know, this is normal, right? This was acceptable. And in this case, we just happen to have a guy who got greedy, asked for a little too much, and got caught. Whatever the case, this person was in big trouble. His boss is going to fire him. So he does something brilliant. He straightens out the books, perhaps cutting the amounts owed back to what was truly owed, perhaps actually slicing off real debt. Bottom line, he forgives a lot of debt with the goal of creating loyal friends who will take care of him if he loses his job. And this is where it gets weird. He gets praised for it. In this interpretation, everyone wins, right? At least to some degree. The business gets paid, probably most or maybe even all of what it is really owed. The debtors are rescued from debt and ruin, and the manager is protected, earning loyalty from the customers and praise from his boss. Win, win, win. I can kind of buy that. But we still have to figure out what the point was. Because we have that whole section at the end where he talks about being faithful and unfaithful and not being trusted and all of that. So we have to try and figure out what this parable teaches us about God, and maybe what it teaches us about Jesus, or maybe what it teaches us about ourselves. Because, again, the swindler here is the hero here is a swindler and a fraud. So I thought a lot about it, and I've decided that one thing I can say about this parable is that it's really very real. Right? This is kind of a down-to-earth parable, which reflects kind of the way the world really is, which means that this parable is messy. Well, Jesus is painting the normal human mess, right? We can start looking at this parable with the rich man, who I think probably represents God, and say that the whole parable is about God, and that, in a way, is true. This parable is about the nature of God and how God interacts with us in the middle of this messy, messy human life. And what this parable suggests from the get-go is that God is full of richness. This God is rich in love, rich in healing, rich in compassion, rich in all these things. But we also learn that God has entrusted his richness to us. Right? God has entrusted God's love, healing, compassion to people, given us those things for us to manage. Which means that, of course, if the rich person is God, then we are the managers. We have been given the treasures by God. We have been given some of God's love, some of God's power, and we're asked to manage this amazing richness, which is where it gets messy. Because, number one, I'm not sure it's entirely healthy to think of ourselves as being the keeper of God's richness, as being those who manage the relationship other people have with God. Right? So it doesn't totally work to put us in the position of the manager. It doesn't totally work for us to be people who tell people what they owe God, for example. Although, in fact, that's often how the church acts, right? As if we are the keeper of the richness of God and can make demands of people and define what God wants and create this sense of debt for other people. As I said, it's a messy parable. But I do think that basically, we are the managers in this parable. And the thrust of the parable is, I think, that we have, in fact, for good or ill, been entrusted with the richness of God. And the thrust of the parable is that as those people who have been entrusted with the richness of God, we can muck it up. We can mess it up. We can hoard the gifts of God. We can live fearfully, we can be judgmental, we can guilt people, we can create unbearable debt spiritually for people. We can make other people's relationship one based on obligation or fear or guilt. There's all kinds of ways that we can mess up this richness that we have been given to manage. We might perhaps focus on ourselves. We might believe that it's all about us and neglect or perhaps even do wrong to other people. But when we mess it up with this boss, or so the parable suggests, the situation is still, in fact, redeemable. When we become convicted by the ways that we have become bad managers, when we have become convicted about the way that we have become maybe oppressors instead of servants, takers instead of givers, roadblocks instead of pathways to God. We are called and empowered to salvage the situation so that everyone wins. We are called at some level to stop playing games, stop holding everything close to ourselves, and become profligate lovers, profligate givers. People who make friends not only for ourselves, but for God. Now it's interesting to note that this parable is a bridge parable. The parable in front of it is the parable of the prodigal son. The parable that follows it is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. In the story of the prodigal son, the father, instead of holding the son's behavior against him, offers prodigal acceptance and welcome. And in contrast, the older brother doesn't. In the story that follows, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man eats from this table laden with rich food, but is not prodigal in acceptance and welcome, but stingy. It does not turn out well. So both of these stories tie into this story, right? What we see in all three of these stories in some way or another are the option between being prodigal and holding things tight, between hugging riches to oneself or using the riches for the benefit of everybody, between being forgiving and not forgiving, between being accepting and not accepting, between generous and being stingy. We have all these options that are there. So these stories make it clear that we have those options. And they offer the warning, all three of the stories, I think, is that if we choose the way of selfishness, the way of me first, if we're not generous with God's love, if we're not generous with the resources that God has given us, it gets ugly. That's kind of a digression. But the point of the parable is not so much that the steward has been mishandling the riches entrusted to him. The point of this story is that when he has mishandled the riches that he has been given, he has the opportunity to change. He has the opportunity to make it right. He has the opportunity to stop misusing what he has, drop the essential selfishness, and become a profligate. Become like the profligate father in the story of the prodigal son, and become like the profligate God who ultimately gives Lazarus the richness that he does not have. What is fascinating to me about this story is that in the end, nobody in this story gets what they deserve. Right? Everybody gets grace. The people who owe the master debt get grace. The slimy manager gets grace. So what I think Jesus is saying in this parable is, number one, we are the managers. We are people who have been given amazing richness that we are called to manage. We're also told that we can mess that up. We're also told that we can rescue ourselves from our self-imposed messes. And the way that we do that is by having a win-win approach, not a win-lose approach. This is Jesus' version of shrewd, right? Is to be a win-win person, not a win-lose person. When we get trapped in a win-lose framework, we don't win. We just lose. When this manager was in a win-lose, I'm going to win, they're going to lose. He lost, they lost. Right? He got in trouble with the boss. and people were paying more than they should have paid. So his way out was to go win-win. I'm going to win by making friends. They're going to win because I'm going to cut their debt. And in a way, the boss wins because the boss gets at least something instead of nothing. We see pretty much the same thing in the two parables that bracket this one, right? The elder brother wouldn't have lost anything by joining the prodigal at the table, right? The father told him, you already have everything. Everything I have belongs to you. So the elder brother had already won. But he needed his brother to lose. And so he couldn't join him at the table. He had enough, more than enough. There was room at the table for the prodigal. If he had just been win-win, he would have been at the party. Well, all that was getting in the way of him having it all, having all the wealth of his father, having the farm, and having his brother too, was his need to be in a win-lose situation. All that was blocking him from the table was his resentment. In the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which is coming up, the rich man is way more than enough, right? Only his self-absorption, only his greed, only his need to have it all for himself, and his willingness for the poor man, Lazarus, to have nothing, kept him from inviting Lazarus to the table. And that win-lose mentality ultimately cost him when he died. And he's on one side of the abyss, and Lazarus and God are on the other side. More about that next week. And by the way, one of the interesting things about that Lazarus story is that the poor man, Lazarus, has a name. The rich man doesn't. Which is the reverse of how it so often is in our world, right? We dehumanize and depersonalize the poor, and we ignore the fact that they're real people. We ignore that they have names. And the names we know are the names of the rich, right? But in that parable, the person who has a name is the poor person. But what this points to is that God is less about rules, less about propriety, perhaps we could even say piety, and more about generosity and sharing and doing whatever we can so that everyone wins. This is really not a parable that is advocating dishonesty. So don't take that home. That's not the lesson. But it is a parable that suggests that our job, once we've created a mess, or maybe our job in order not to create a mess, is to be kind and generous. Welcome, accepting. Our job is to manage the amazing richness that God has given us so that everyone wins. Now, I'm going to admit that that is a messy concept, right? Being managers of love and grace is not always logical. It does not always add up. Making sure that everyone wins, that going win-win, is not always what we think of as being appropriate even, right? Sometimes it seems as if we're being asked to do something that is frankly unfair. We're being asked to be forgiving of people who maybe don't deserve, in our heads, forgiveness. We're being asked to be generous to people that sometimes in our heads don't deserve our generosity. We're being asked to give up what we want for ourselves, what we think we deserve in order to benefit others, and that doesn't feel good. So sometimes we struggle with this concept of win-win. And sometimes we fail at this concept of win-win. I know I certainly do. Sometimes we hoard grace and hoard love and money and power, and we play games and we manipulate, and we don't mind if others lose. But when we get into that mentality, we create a mess. And it's a mess of our own making. And we end up doing things that are questionable and perhaps even wrong. And sometimes as we try to deal with all of that stuff, we end up in disaster. We pile error upon error upon error. And sometimes it collapses on us and life crashes in. And we're like that steward, that slimy steward, caught, exposed, and in big trouble. Jesus is reflecting all of this in that story. But he's also saying, never quit. Never quit trying. Never quit trying to create wins for yourself and for everyone else in the midst of the mess. As our formulas crumble and threats come from every side, in the middle of the mess as we deal with failure, moral and otherwise, in the middle of the mess when we've been a little bit greedy or a little bit selfish, we are called to wake up and get shrewd. And shrewd, remember, means being win-win people. We're called to do whatever we can to make things right, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else. We are called to let go of our fear and our greed and our need to protect, and we are called to be prodigals, rogue agents of God, forgiving and helping, doing whatever we can to build relationships with those around us, doing whatever we can to make friends for God, doing whatever we can to create wins in other people's lives. And how far are we to go in those kinds of efforts? I always think of Christ, right? Christ was kind of the ultimate trickster. What could be trickier than winning by going to the cross? We do whatever it takes. In the parable, the steward does what it takes, right? He throws the standard business procedures out the window. And he does whatever it takes to make friends for himself. And what happens is, right, that people's homes are probably saved. People's businesses are saved. The owner wins because he gets recast in a new light. All of a sudden, he's Mr. Generous. Everyone now has a friend in the business. And what we have in that story is a win and a win and a win. In our time, we're in the same kind of world. And what we're told is be shrewd. Make it so it's win and win and win. Because if we do that, right, if we act in ways that create wins for other people, not just wins for ourselves, people might get a new image of God. People might be supported in practical ways and fed and clothed and housed. People might be freed to love themselves and love other people. Even if we don't do what we do perfectly, even if sometimes we mess up, we can keep trying and we can keep negotiating and we can keep creating wins, and God will honor that. You know, it is a tough world out there, right? There's a lot of losses happening for a lot of people. It would be really easy to hug stuff to ourselves and to quit trying to make a difference. People do that all the time. They just quit. They go into hiding. They live on the scraps of what's left of their lives, and they hold what they have to themselves. But Jesus says, don't quit. Keep going. Be rogue agents of God's radical and outrageous generosity. Be prodigals. Do whatever it takes to make friends for God. Do whatever it takes to give other people wins, because there are wins out there for everyone, including ourselves, if we are shrewd. Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you for this messy parable. We hope that you can help us be people who are shrewd, who find ways to create wins for everyone we meet. Sometimes it may not feel like those people deserve the win. Sometimes it may not feel like we can afford to do what we're wanting to do. Sometimes we will just be confused and want to quit. But Lord, we are told basically that out of the richness that you have given us, we can create those wins. And we can make this a better world. Help us to be that way. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.